Welcome everyone! Today on Becca Makes Costumes, we're going to be talking about how to turn a flat graphic into a curved design so that you can put it on the front of a curved mask. Alright, let's begin! I'm going to start by using some thick paper. Normally I'd want to use like an acetate or a polyvinyl, but since I'm only going to print 2 or 3 masks with this stencil, it'll survive. The issue with using paper normally is that the paint can seep into the paper and warp the stencil. But that's totally okay. Right now we're just having fun. So I'm gonna take this graphic that I found online and cut it out. I wanna make that center front have a curve to it so I can fit it onto the pattern of my mask. Bam! Would you look at that TV magic? So I'm gonna fold it in half and cut it down the center so that I can curve that center part to match the curve of the center front of the mask. Okay, so now I'm gonna make some decisions about where I wanna cut out parts of the design to transfer it onto my stencil. You wanna make sure that you're not leaving any floats that are smaller than 1/8 of an inch. It's just hard for the paper to stay fixed in those moments, and so it's easier to have bigger floats in between things. So I'm gonna make some decisions because I can't keep the level of detail that's in the graphic. So right now I'm choosing to use the bottom of the mouth because I think that's an important part of the design, is the size and scale of those parts of the design. And then I'm gonna look at the face. I think one of the keys to this design is how angry the graphic looks. So I'm gonna make sure that I'm keeping the angle of the furrowed eyebrows above the eyes to make it look angry. The other area that I think is really important to keep consistent from the design is how angry the mouth is. In the graphic, there's teeth and a tongue and the jaw. They're all a little bit too close together to keep all of that detail. So I'm just gonna take the upper lip, the lower jaw, and the teeth as the most important part of this design. So in order to capture that, I'm gonna make the teeth a little bit bigger, and I'm gonna do a few less teeth. So really I'm gonna focus on a big fang on top and a big fang on the bottom, and some teeth that fill in the 2 fangs on the top and bottom. Now I'm going to cut out all of the triangles first. I think it's easier to start with the bigger areas and then move to the smaller ones. I think it means that I know that I'm capturing the places that I think are most important. Because once I have all this cut out, then I can fill in a lot of the little spaces in between the design. Or I can even go back in and add more places that I want to be cut out in the stencil that I didn't cut out in the original design to transfer it to the stencil. So I'm using an X-Acto blade here, and one of the things that I realized as I was cutting it out is that sometimes it's easier to move the paper than it is to move the knife. But one of the most important things is that I realized I work a lot from my whole arm rather than just trying to move the knife. So in order to curve the design, I'm going to have to cut into some of the areas to slash and spread and open up that center front to match the pattern. The next step is to transfer the design to the pattern that we're using. The one that I'm using, I found on a website, and you'll find the link to that website in the description of this video. So now I'm going to line my pattern piece up with the edge of my stencil. This is going to help me find the grain when I go to cut out the pattern. Now I'm going to make some registration marks. These registration marks want to be about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch long, and you want them to continue off of the lines of the pattern so that you can line up the pattern after the piece has been printed. So now I'm going to start curving my piece of paper to the curve of the front of the mask. And I'm just going to use some tape to hold down each piece as I curve along. The piece of paper isn't going to just curve, so I clip into the design to slash and spread it open. I also wanted to think about where my graphic was going to line up on the face of the person on the mask, and I was shooting for the mouth to be over the mouth of the person. Okay, so now I'm going to draw those areas that I pinned down. I'm going to start with the most important places. I'm going to push the paper pattern back so that I'm keeping the shapes of each of the triangles, but adjusting the paper so that it picks up where I've moved them to along the curve. I'm going to capture where the teeth belong and where the top of the jaw ends up when I curve this graphic. An important thing to remember is these are all ideas. So after I've marked out everything from this pattern onto my stencil, I'll be able to change everything about it. This is just like creating all the reference points so that then you can translate the design from something that was straight into something that's curved, but still feels reminiscent of the original design. Sometimes I find it helpful to put little folds in the paper so that I can get the paper to lie flatter while I draw each of the pieces that I cut out. So you can see how I am bending and manipulating the paper so that I can move each of those shapes to somewhere that makes sense when I've curved the front of the piece of paper. Great, time to make some decisions. I find it helpful to put the other half of the pattern of the paper graphic next to my stencil so that I can look at what the original intention was and make some decisions from that. So I found that the nice thing about using pencil originally is that it was fully erasable, and now when I'm making decisions in the white pencil, it's really easy to see. So I'm paying close attention to the fangs because I want to keep the scariness of the original design. So I'm making sure that the fangs play a large role in how the final stencil looks. The other thing I thought a lot about was how to make it easier to match up that center front line with all the pieces. So I'm letting anywhere that I can run 1/8 of an inch over the center front line. So the nose is going to be a little bit wider, and the jaw on the top and the bottom goes out from the center line also, 1/8 of an inch. So we're going to sew over that and it'll go away, but it just means that there isn't a little gap of fabric in that front seam. You know, honestly, this drawing might have been better if I was left-handed. Shout out to all my lefties. So for the straight triangle pieces, I'm using a ruler because, let's be honest, no one's perfect, and making straight edges is always easier with a straight edge. Okay, so I'm double checking to make sure that when I curve it, I'm still keeping the original design intentions. So, angry face, I'm making sure that the eyes are slanted enough that they still feel angry, and I'm making sure that the triangles that are radiating away from it feel like they're still following the same trajectory as they were in the original graphic. Alright, now I'm going to cut out the stencil. I'm going to start with the registration marks. They just want to be little rectangles, just enough so that the sponge can put some paint through. We do actually want to paint through our registration marks because that's what's going to help us line up our pattern when we go out to cut out the stencil. Now I'm going to cut out the rest of the stencil. The nice thing about the thick paper compared to the printer paper is that it's a lot easier not to break the areas that are the floats, just because this paper can hold up to being cut with an X-Acto knife. So I felt comfortable doing this freehand, but don't hesitate to pull out a ruler. I think that the thing that I found to be trickiest when I was doing this was the eyes, because they're so curved and so small. So one thing that I found helpful was to keep the knife still and turn the paper as I was cutting, rather than the other way around. Look at that, and it's done. So I just checked to make sure I could see through everything and that my corners had all been cut cleanly, because you don't want that little fluff from pulling it out. All right, so now let's print it on some fabric. In order to set up my fabric, I laid down a trash bag on my table and taped that down. And then I pinned my fabric to the table so that it was square and I could line up the grain. And now I'm going to tape down my stencil to the fabric. Right on the edge where I have my registration marks, I got a little too close to the edge of the paper, so it would be really hard to print those registration marks without going onto the rest of my fabric. So I made sure and laid down some tape so that all that paint gets trapped. So I'm just going to use this piece of plastic that I found from the top of a Swiffer container to be the plastic that I use as my paint tray. I also found this piece of foam in my craft stash, but you could use any foam you had lying around the house, like a dish sponge. Just remember that the texture that you have on your printing tool is going to show up in the paint. So if you use something like a paper towel, you could get a little bit of a scruffy finish, but that could be cool. So I like to tie my foam up with a hair elastic, and that way my foam gets nice and taut and I get a little puffiness. I'm using some white fabric paint to print my design. You could use acrylic paint in a pinch. So the next thing that's really important is that I wanted to get some paint onto my sponge and not have a big glob go on at first. And I'm also going to start by printing my registration marks because they're important and I don't want to forget them. Also, next up on the equipment list is a tripod with a boom. Okay, so now I'm printing the stencil, and I want to make sure that the paint is getting full coverage and try not to slide my sponge around because I don't want the paint to end up getting smushed under the stencil. So I found sometimes it's good to use like a rocking motion to get the paint to transfer more evenly. And I'm also going to pay attention to the even coverage in the stencil. Alright, looks pretty good. Let's take the tape off and see what happened.
All right, not too bad. There's a little bit of bleeding, which is to be expected from using paper, but I think it's going to be fine. Okay, so let's talk about camera angles. I'm still learning. So here I am painting in the red eyes. I realize you couldn't see that from the black and white paper I printed earlier, but I thought it would be fun and it would make the design look a little bit more dastardly. So I'm just using a tiny paintbrush, and this is more fabric paint. All right, now I'm going to cut out the lining. So to cut out fabric, I laid it out, and I'm making sure to line up the grain that I have marked on my pattern with the selvage edge, which you can see at the far end of the ruler. Now I'm going to pin along the grain line to make sure that the pattern stays where I want it to be. Sometimes it's helpful to make your pins be like little tent poles and have some tension in between them so that when you run your pencil along the edge, it doesn't shift the pattern on you. Now I'm using just a plain number 2 pencil because I'm drawing this pattern piece on very light fabric, so it's easy to see. The other thing I think is important is that I'm running the pencil off the edge of the pattern, and that makes perfect corners. And corners are important because you want to be able to line them up when you go to pin the 2 pieces together. So my pattern does not include seam allowance, so I'm going to go ahead and draw it on after I've drawn both pieces onto the fabric. Don't forget to reverse your pattern piece so that you get a left and a right side. Now I'm drawing the seam allowance around each of my pattern pieces. I'm using the long side of my ruler to make it go faster. When you have a see-through ruler, a 1/2 inch is halfway between the 2 fat lines. And a 1/4 inch is halfway in between that. So it's 2 little lines. Now I'm drawing the seam allowance around the pattern piece. I'm putting a 1/4 inch of seam allowance around each of the pieces. Great, now let's cut them out. Now I'm going to cut out my outside pieces. It's a great thing that the registration marks bled all the way through the fabric. If your fabric is thicker, you can put pins in at each of your registration marks so that you can see where they are on the other side of the fabric. I'm going to place my pattern piece on the fabric and line up each of the corners with the registration marks. And now I can draw my pattern piece onto the fabric. I'm going to give myself a 1/2 inch of seam allowance around the pattern piece and 1 inch on the ends. I'm giving myself more seam allowance on this piece to make it easier to line up the pattern. Hey, look at that! They're totally gonna go together. Okay, now for the pinning. Normally, I tell you to pin each of the corners together, but to line up the pattern, I'm gonna line up the pattern pieces before I match up the corners. Because what I'm really trying to achieve is pattern matching. So I'm lining up the top piece and the bottom pieces of the printed pattern on the line that I drew for the pattern piece. So I found that the lower jaw and the forehead were the easiest spots on this particular pattern, and then I matched up the nose. So I'm folding the fabric open so that I can see that my pin is going right next to where the paint has printed. And then I'm looking at the lines to make sure that my pin is staying on the line. Okay, pinning on the line. So I like to hold it in my pinching fingers, and then I can flip the fabric back and forth to make this process go faster. Look at that. Okay, time to sew. So I'm going to put my tails behind, lift the needle, turn it on, put my work in, lower the presser foot, make sure that the needle's down. Make sure that my hands aren't going to get sewn. And I'm going to start by taking out the first pin, because I was pretty close to begin with. So then I'm sewing, and I'm going to lock stitch, and then I'm going to keep sewing, removing pins as I go. And I'm almost to the end, so I'm going to start thinking about a lock stitch, and I'm going to sew. Great! Now I'm going to lock stitch and sew off the end. Okay, and now I'm going to clip my tails, making sure that I have enough tails by my machine, but I'm going to clip close to the piece because I don't need tails on my piece. Alright, look! Those lined up really well. I think we're going to keep it. If at this point things weren't lined up, I could have gone back with a seam ripper and tried again. Alright. Now I'm going to sew the mask together. Okay, so I'm going to trim my tails, but I'm also going to trim down the seam allowance of the outside fabric to match my lining fabric. Because I really don't need a whole 1/2 inch seam allowance inside that seam. It would just make it hard to work with. And I'm going to do the same to the bottom. Okay, so I flipped my mask inside out, and then I remembered that I didn't clip the curve. So you need to clip the curve because that releases the fabric and allows it to stretch over the curve when it's inside out. If you don't do it, your mask will end up wrinkly along the edges and it'll feel weird. So I'm making sure not to clip over the stitch line because you don't want to have to go back and re-sew that seam. All right, let's flip it inside out. Oh yeah, much better. Okay, so now I'm gonna press the fabric. I'm gonna roll the lining fabric back so that my outside fabric is what you see when you flip it to the outside of the mask. I'm using a couple hams so that I can mimic the face shape, but you could use anything that you can iron over, like a rolled towel. Now I'm going to iron the nose part, and I'm just turning the mask shape and folding the seam so that it lies nicely, and then pressing it into place. And now I'm going to do the bottom. All right, look at that. Okay, so now I'm gonna fold in the ends so that I have a place for the ties. And I'm just gonna roll it twice and then press it flat. And on the other side. And then off camera, I'm gonna sew them down right on the edge. Then you can thread a tie through it so that it goes over your face, and then pull the ties so that they go behind your neck. All right, we've just made the new fashion accessory of the summer. I hope this will inspire you to make your own gorgeous creations. See you next time.